The wind that night was a razor, cutting through the thin wool of my coat as I stood on the porch of the house I used to call home. For 5 years, I had avoided this place, not because of some grand, explosive fight, but because of the slow, agonizing erosion of who I was supposed to be in my parents' eyes. Every time I looked at the dark wood of the front door, I felt the familiar weight of being the family's biggest disappointment. I was even the son who couldn't quite make it, the one who struggled with the basics of adult life, the one they called unstable whenever I dared to question why things were so hard. I adjusted my tie, a cheap one I'd bought for a job interview, that never went anywhere, and took a breath. Inside, the air would be thick with the smell of roasted turkey and the even heavier scent of old money. My parents, Mark and Susan, lived in a world of polished surfaces where everything had its place. And my place had always been at the very edge of the frame, blurred and out of focus. I knocked, and the sound seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. It was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were manicured, even in late November, where the silence felt expansive. When the door opened, the warmth of the foyer hit me, but it didn't feel welcoming. It felt like a trap. My mother, Susan, stood there in a silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She didn't hug me. She performed a hug, a quick lean-in that ensured her makeup wouldn't smudge. She told me I looked tired. Her voice carried that high pitch, fragile cheerfulness she used when she wanted to signal to the world that she was a saint for putting up with me. My father was in the living room, his back to the fire, looking like a man who had never known a day of true financial panic in his life. He gave me a firm handshake, the kind men give to business rivals they don't particularly respect. And then there was Brooke, my younger sister, sitting on the sofa with her phone glued to her palm, her eyes flicking up just long enough to offer a bored, practiced smile. The house was different since the last time I'd been there. There was a newness to everything that felt aggressive. The kitchen had been gutted and replaced with marble that looked like frozen smoke. The furniture was sleek, modern, and looked entirely uncomfortable. I wondered, as I stood there holding a glass of water I didn't want, how they were doing it. My father's firm had been struggling a few years back, or so he told me when I asked for a small loan to cover a medical bill. He'd looked me in the eye then and told me that the family was under extreme pressure, that every cent was accounted for, and that I needed to learn the value of $1 by earning it the hard way. I'd believed him. I'd spent the next 3 years working 70-hour weeks, my bank account often sitting at a balance so low it felt like a personal insult, while they seemingly thrived. The energy shifted the moment the black town car pulled into the driveway. My grandfather, Harold Whitmore, was the sun around which the family's entire solar system orbited. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing, a billionaire who valued precision, loyalty, and results. When he walked through the door, the air in the room didn't just warm up, it pressurized. Beside him was Daniel, a man I knew only as the Shadow, Harold's longtime legal counsel. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't have to. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it held the secrets of a dozen nations. My father straightened his posture instantly, his shoulders moving back as if he were a soldier at attention. My mother's smile widened until her cheeks actually began to tremble from the effort. Brooke even put her phone away, smoothing her hair with a sudden, frantic focus. We moved to the dining room, a space dominated by a heavy oak table that felt like it belonged in a courtroom rather than a home. The meal was a masterpiece of performance, art. We talked about travel, about the stock market, about the new renovations. I sat at the far end, trying to be invisible, nodding when someone spoke to me and keeping my hands in my lap so no one would see them shaking. I was thinking about my apartment across town, the one with the drafty windows and the landlord who didn't care if the heat worked as long as the check cleared. I was thinking about the $4 I had in my pocket and the long walk I'd have to take back to the bus stop because I couldn't afford the surge pricing on a rideshare app tonight. Halfway through the main course, the clinking of silverware stopped. My grandfather had put his fork down. The sound was small, but it was like a gunshot in that room. He didn't look at my father or my mother. He looked directly at me. His eyes were sharp, 2 points of light that seemed to see right through the cheap fabric of my suit and into the exhaustion I was trying so hard to hide. He asked me how I had been living lately. My mother tried to answer for me, her voice a frantic bird chirp about how Ethan is so independent, he just loves doing things on his own. But Harold didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on me. He told me I looked like I hadn't slept in a year. Brooke made a comment under her breath about how I always loved playing the martyr, a remark that normally would have stung, but I was too focused on the look in my grandfather's eyes. Then he said it. He said it with the casualness of a man discussing the weather, yet it was the most terrifying sentence I had ever heard. He told me he hoped the $15,000 he had been sending me every single month for the last 5 years had made my life a little more manageable. He said it was important for a young man starting out to have a safety net, to have his rent covered so he could focus on his career. He said he wanted me to know I was supported. The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at my father, whose face had gone a strange, ashen grey. I looked at my mother, whose hand was frozen halfway to her mouth, her fingers clutching a wine glass, like it was the only thing keeping her on the planet. I heard my own voice ask the question, and it sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone far away. "What are you talking about?" I asked him. I told him I had never seen a dime of that money. I told him I had been living on peanut butter and overtime shifts for years. I told him I had nearly been evicted 3 times in the last 24 months. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever experienced. My father tried to laugh it off, a hollow, rattling sound that died in his throat. He told Harold that I was just being Ethan, that I was confused, that I didn't have a head for numbers. My mother chimed in, her voice trembling, saying they had managed the money for me because I wasn't in a position to handle such a large responsibility. They looked at me with eyes full of a desperate, silent plea for me to play along, to be the unstable one again, to accept the lie so the performance could continue. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a disappointment. I felt a cold, hard clarity rising up from my stomach. I realized that my parents hadn't just been cold to me. They had been stealing my life, 1 month at a time, for 5 years. I looked at Brooke, and for the first time, I didn't see a bored teenager. I saw the designer bag she was wearing, the expensive jewelry on her wrists, the smugness that had finally slipped into a mask of pure panic. She knew. She had always known. She had watched me struggle, watched me walk miles in the rain because I couldn't afford the bus, all while she lived off the money that was meant to keep me safe. My grandfather didn't blink. He sat there, a king on his throne, and watched the kingdom he had funded crumble in front of him. He turned to Daniel, the man with the briefcase, and the clicking of the metal latches on that leather bag sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie, and the truth was about to be laid out on the table alongside the turkey and the fine china. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing that the people who were supposed to love me the most had been the very ones keeping my head under water. My father stood up, his palms flat on the table, trying to exert a power he knew long ago possessed, but my grandfather didn't even look up at him. He just reached for a document Daniel was holding out. The game was over. The performance was done. And as the first page of the bank records hit the table, I knew that my life, as the confused sun, was ending, and something much more dangerous was beginning. I sat there, paralyzed, as the math began to scream in my head. $15,000 a month. That was $180,000 a year. Over 5 years, that was nearly $1 million. $900,000 to be exact. I thought about the winter of 3 years ago. I thought about the night I sat in my freezing studio apartment, wrapped in 3 blankets because the heater had broken and I didn't have the $200 to fix it. I remembered calling my father, my voice trembling from the cold and the shame, asking him if he could just loan me enough to get through the month. I remembered him sighing into the phone, that heavy, disappointed sound he made when he wanted me to feel like a burden. He'd told me that the family was tight, that Brooke's tuition was rising, and that I needed to stop looking for handouts and start acting like a man who could provide for himself. All the while, he was sitting on a mountain of my money. He was probably looking at the new marble countertops in his kitchen while he told me he couldn't afford to keep his son from freezing. The betrayal didn't just hurt. It felt like it was rewriting my entire history. Every memory of the last 5 years was being stained by this new truth. I remembered the day I lost my car because the transmission blew, and I didn't have the savings to repair it. I'd walked 3 miles to work every day for 6 months, through the summer heat and the autumn rain, arrive at my shift drenched and exhausted. My parents had seen me. They'd seen the blisters on my feet. My mother had even offered to buy me a new pair of walking shoes, calling it a charity gift to help me get back on my feet. I had thanked her. I had felt guilty for taking even that small thing from them. Now I realized that the shoes she'd bought me were paid for with a fraction of the money they'd stolen from me that very same week. It was a sick, twisted game. They weren't just stealing the money. They were stealing my dignity. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to feel like a failure, so I would never have the confidence to ask where the support was. My father finally found his voice, though it sounded thin and ragged. He looked at my grandfather and said that they were only trying to protect the family's future. He said that I was volatile, that I'd always had episodes where I couldn't be trusted with large sums of money. He looked at me then, his eyes pleading with me to be the victim they'd spent years convincing me I was. He told me, "Ethan, you remember how you were after college. You weren't yourself. You were struggling. We just wanted to make sure there was a nest egg for you when you were finally stable." But Daniel didn't let him finish. He pulled out another folder, this one filled with spreadsheets and bank statements from my mother's personal accounts. He started listing the withdrawals. $50,000 for a kitchen renovation, $20,000 for a luxury cruise, $12,000 for a wellness retreat for my sister, a new car, custom furniture, designer clothes. The list went on and on, a laundry list of vanity and greed. Every time Daniel read a new number, it felt like a physical blow to my chest. They hadn't been managing a nest egg. They had been treating my grandfather's trust like a personal ATM. I looked at Brooke, who was now staring at the table, her face a mask of cold fury rather than shame. I asked her if she knew. I asked her if she knew that her trips to Hawaii and her designer bags were paid for with the money meant to keep me from the brink of homelessness. She didn't even look up. She just scoffed and said that I wouldn't have known what to do with that kind of money anyway, that I'd have wasted it on stupid things or just lost it. She said it like it was a fact of nature, like I was some kind of subhuman who didn't deserve a roof over my head, while she deserved a life of luxury. My grandfather, Harold, stood up then. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The silence he commanded was more terrifying than any scream. He looked at his son, my father, with a look of such profound disgust that it seemed to physically push my dad back into his chair. Harold said that he had built his company on the idea of integrity, and that he had raised a thief and a liar. He told my mother that she was no longer welcome in his home or his life. But he wasn't done. He turned back to Daniel and told him to proceed with the formal notice. My father's eyes went wide. "Notice?" he asked. "What notice?" Daniel pulled out a final document, a formal legal complaint for the misappropriation of funds and fraud. He explained that because the money was specifically designated in the trust for my housing and support, their use of it for personal luxury constituted a criminal act. They weren't just in trouble with Grandpa, they were in trouble with the law. The room erupted then. My mother started sobbing, real tears this time, though I suspected they were tears for herself and not for me. She fell to her knees, begging Harold not to do this, saying it would ruin their reputation, that they'd never be able to show their faces at the club again. My father started shouting about how Harold couldn't do this to his own flesh and blood, how he was tearing the family apart. But I just sat there, watching them. For the first time in my life, the gaslighting wasn't working. I wasn't the confused one. I wasn't the unstable one. I was the only person in that room who had been telling the truth for 5 years, even when I didn't know what the truth was. I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. I realized that I didn't owe these people anything. Not my loyalty, not my silence, and certainly not my forgiveness. Grandpa Harold walked over to me and put a hand on my shoulder. His hand was heavy and warm, a stark contrast to the coldness of the rest of the room. He told me that he was sorry. He said that he had trusted the wrong people to take care of what mattered most. He looked at my parents and told them they had 1 hour to pack whatever they could carry and leave the house. He told them that the accounts were already being frozen and that every asset they'd purchased with my money would be liquidated to pay back the trust. He was stripping them of everything, the house, the cars, the status they'd built on the back of my suffering. My sister started screaming then, calling me a rat, saying I'd destroyed her life. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I realized I didn't even recognize the woman standing in front of me. She wasn't my sister. She was just another person who had used me to get what she wanted. As they began to scramble, a chaotic mess of crying and shouting and frantic phone calls, I stood up and walked toward the door. I didn't want to watch them fall apart. I'd spent enough of my life watching myself fall apart while they cheered from the sidelines. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air hitting my face like a blessing. My grandfather followed me out, leaving Daniel inside to handle the logistics. We stood there in the silence of the expensive neighborhood, the lights of the other houses glowing with a warmth that felt hollow now. He asked me what I wanted to do next. He told me that the $900,000 plus interest and penalties would be transferred into a new account, one that only I had access to. He told me I never had to work a double shift again if I didn't want to. But I didn't feel rich. I just felt empty. I told him I wanted to go home. Not to this house, but to my drafty apartment. I wanted to sit in the quiet and figure out who I was, now that I wasn't the struggling son anymore. The silence of my apartment that first morning was different than it had ever been before. Usually, the quiet felt like a heavy blanket of failure, a reminder that I was alone because I couldn't cut it in the real world. But that morning, as I sat on the edge of my bed watching the grey light filter through the cracked window, the silence felt like a clean slate. My phone had been buzzing since dawn with a frantic, desperate energy. Messages from my mother, voice notes from my father, and a string of vitriolic texts from Brooke that shifted between begging for forgiveness and accusing me of being a monster. I didn't open any of them. I didn't need to hear their voices to know exactly what they were saying. They were drowning, and they were trying to pull me under with them one last time. Convinced that family was a life jacket I was obligated to provide. A few days later, I found myself in Daniel's office. It was a space that felt like a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the city. Everything in that room was precise, expensive, and utterly indifferent to emotion. Daniel sat across from me, his expression as unreadable as a stone wall, while he laid out the true extent of the devastation. It wasn't just the $900,000. As they'd dug into the accounts, they found a web of smaller thefts. Credit lines opened in my name that I never knew existed, and a series of administrative fees my father had been charging the trust for the burden of managing my life. The total was staggering. It wasn't just money they had taken. They had been building a lifestyle on the deliberate sabotage of my future. Daniel told me that the process of asset liquidation had already begun. The house was being prepared for sale. The cars were being repossessed. The luxury goods, the jewelry, even the custom marble in that kitchenette was all being converted back into the currency of my stolen years. I asked Daniel if they would actually go to prison. He looked at me with a rare moment of something resembling empathy and explained that while the criminal charges were on the table, my grandfather was pushing for a restitution agreement that would strip them of every cent they owned without the public spectacle of a trial lest they fought it. And they were fighting it. They were trying to claim that the money was a gift to the family unit, that I was a dependent who didn't understand the nuances of wealth management. They were doubling down on the lie that I was unstable. It was their only defense, their only way to keep the walls from closing in. But Daniel just tapped a folder on his desk and told me that bank records don't have episodes. They don't get confused. They just show the truth. The day of the final mediation felt like the end of a long, exhausting war. We met in a sterile conference room that smelled of lemon polish and bad coffee. My parents were already there when I walked in with my grandfather. They looked like ghosts of the people I had seen at Thanksgiving. My father's suit was wrinkled, his face sallow and aged by a decade in just a few weeks. My mother wouldn't look at me. She just kept staring at her hands, which were twisting a damp tissue into a shredded mess. Brooke was there too, looking defiant but brittle, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a hatred that was almost vibrating. The room was heavy with the weight of things that couldn't be unsaid. The mediator, a woman with a voice like dry parchment, started reading the terms. It was a total surrender. They would sign over the deed to the house. They would vacate all claims to the trust. They would agree to a permanent no-contact order, unless it was through legal counsel. In exchange, the criminal fraud charges would be stayed, provided the full restitution was met through the sale of their assets. My father spoke up once, his voice cracking like dry wood. He looked at my grandfather and asked how he could do this to his own son, how he could leave them with nothing after everything they'd built. Grandpa Harold didn't even blink. He told my father that he hadn't built anything. He had merely rented a life with money that belonged to a man he was supposed to protect. The moment the pens hit the paper, it felt like the air finally returned to the room. I watched my mother sign her name, her hand shaking so much the signature was barely legible. When it was Brooke's turn, she slammed the pen down and looked at me, her voice a hissed whisper. She told me she hoped the money made me happy, because I didn't have a family anymore. I looked back at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the sting of her words. I told her that I hadn't had a family for 5 years. I'd just had a group of creditors who happened to share my last name. She flinched as if I'd slapped her, and for a second the mask of defiance dropped, revealing the terrifying emptiness underneath. After it was over, I stood on the sidewalk outside the office building. The city was moving around me, loud and chaotic and completely unaware of the earthquake that had just leveled my personal world. My grandfather stood beside me, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He told me that the restoration was complete. The money was back where it belonged. He told me that he had set up a new trust for me, one that was protected by 3 different layers of oversight, and that I would never have to worry about a roof over my head again. I thanked him, but I told him I didn't want a mansion or a penthouse. I told him I'd found a small house on the other side of town, a place with a garden and a porch that didn't feel like a stage. I wanted to live a life that was quiet, a life where I didn't have to perform for anyone's approval. I spent the next few months rebuilding. I used a portion of the money to pay off every debt I'd ever touched. I hired a private investigator to make sure there were no more hidden accounts or surprise credit lines in my name. I started a small business, a workshop where I could work with my hands, far away from the world of marble kitchens and silk dresses. And I started going to therapy, not because I was unstable, but because I needed to learn how to trust my own eyes again. I needed to unlearn the voices in my head that told me I was a failure every time I struggled. I learned that my struggles weren't a sign of weakness. They were the inevitable result of being sabotaged by the people I trusted most. The last time I saw my parents was in the local news, a small blurb about a high-end property being auctioned off for significantly less than its value. They had moved into a small rental in a part of the state they used to mock. There were no more cruises, no more wellness retreats, no more independent children to gaslight. They were finally living the life they had tried to force on Mia. Life of counting pennies and wondering where it all went wrong. I didn't feel joy in their downfall. I just felt a profound sense of relief that I was no longer the fuel for their fire. I often think back to that Thanksgiving dinner, to the clink of the crystal and the practiced smiles. I realize now that the dinner wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was the 5 years of silence that preceded it. I learned that love without accountability is just a different form of control. I learned that sometimes the only way to find your truth is to let the world you knew burn down to the ground. My life didn't end at that table when the secrets came out. It began the moment I stopped asking for permission to be seen. I'm no longer the son who couldn't make it. I'm the man who survived them. And as I sit on my own porch now, watching the sun set over a life that is finally, truly mine, I know that the most expensive thing my family ever stole from me wasn't the $900,000. It was my peace, and I've finally bought it back.